Welcome to my studio. I'm Father Thomas Loya. I am a Byzantine Catholic priest of the Byzantine Eparchy of Parma. And in our studio, we make the invisible visible. And there is hardly any better way to do that than with the art that is the official art of the eastern lung of the church. Actually, for many centuries, the whole church, east and west, and that is the art of iconography. In fact, the word icon means image. It actually means making something invisible visible. You know those little images on your computer screens? Those aren't icons. I know we call them that, but these are icons. What we're going to talk about today is what iconography really is. And iconography is a canonized art form. It is the official art form of most of the eastern lung of the church, most of the eastern rites of the Catholic Church, and also the Eastern Orthodox churches. Now, iconography also is essentially the official art of the whole church. When we really come down to it, icons or iconography is the official art. If you really want to pinpoint an art of the church, east and west, it is iconography. In the West, other art forms were allowed to develop over time, but in the East, they tended to codify and canonize this one form of art called iconography. As I mentioned, the word icon means image, to image something, to make visible what is invisible. And the important thing to remember about icons is that it's not just an art form, it's not just a craft or a hobby. Iconography is actually a theology in color. It's windows into the divine. It is like taking the scriptures and putting it out in front of us on a board or on a wall or a ceiling. As the scriptures, we pick up a Bible has words, characters, letters and words on a page, and that communicates the Word of God. Well, you can also communicate the Word of God through line and color, and that's what icons are. And that's why they follow a certain form, a certain style, a certain canonized art form. If you notice, whenever you look at icons, they seem to have a certain style. Let's look at a few icons. Whenever I want to do icons, I always do as much research as possible. I'll go through my books on iconography, all kinds of examples. I'll get them these are from bulletin covers. I get them from anywhere I can. I have a vast library of icons and icon books. Just to do one icon, I'll research every rendition of that I can find. And the reason is because you want to get it correct. You want to see what are the parameters, what are the areas that you can kind of have some kind of leeway. What is the composition? What are the rules as such? Because you see, icons, in every way that they're painted, they mean things. They mean something. Let me give you an example. Let's look at a couple of icons. Here's a reproduction of an icon of a saint, of an ascetical saint, St. Anthony. St. Anthony of the Desert. He was one of the founders of monasticism. If you notice the way he's painted in a way that's sort of stylized with a lot of an appearance of someone who's sort of been kind of weather beaten, as it were, kind of out there in the sun, in the desert, who's been fasting and going through rigorous kinds of self-discipline and asceticism. So his face is kind of stylized like that. There's lots of convolutions in it. And also the icon is very frontal. And he holds in his hand a scroll, a script, and he holds his hands in such a way as to kind of draw us to the script and also to his face. You see, the composition of icons is almost always very, very frontal because they're engaging us in their reality. Let's look at another one. Here's an icon of the Virgin Mother and Child, the Theotokos, the Mother of God and Christ. Now, if you notice, Mother of God has three, well, you can't see the third one, but it's behind Christ, but she always has three stars. This represents the fact that she remained a virgin before, during, and after the birth of Christ. Now that's a theological statement, and it's indicated by the three stars. So she must have three stars, or at least three stars implied. Also, if you notice the gesture and how she's positioned, she's looking straight out at us to engage our eyes, to engage our gaze at her. And your eye then will have a tendency to then move down her shoulder to her hand. So there's sort of a rhythm like this. Because what she's doing is she's catching our attention and saying, I am the intercessor. I lead you to Christ. Come to my Son, who is, of course, Christ, being held in her arms here. Now, her robes are usually a very deep, dark kind of red, and this symbolizes the fact that, because red is sort of an earthy color, it symbolizes the fact that Jesus Christ, the second person of Trinity, who was invisible, became visible, took on his human nature through her. In other words, he kind of gets his human nature through her. So that sort of reddish, clay, earthy kind of deep red is used in the Virgin Mary. It also represents her queenliness. She is queen of heaven, and her royalty from the house of David. So there's many meanings for the color of this type of red, and there are some variations, but basically she always wears this deep red on the outside. And for those theological reasons, remember, iconography is making visible invisible realities, like theology and truth, matters of God that are real but invisible, and so they're made real through the line and the color. Now, Jesus, in this picture, is wearing kind of a light color, like a white, kind of a regal color. Oftentimes we'll see Christ, such as in this picture here. We'll see him wearing blue and red. Sometimes, though, as we see here, he'll be wearing a kind of a lighter color. This generally represents him in a kind of triumphant way or a kind of a royal way. This represents Christ with two natures, his human and his divine, the red and the blue. And so Christ is always painted and must always be painted with red and blue. Otherwise, he's painted with the sort of the royal gold or white. Other than that, you do not paint Christ just any color you want, because again, you're painting theology in color. Again, you notice the pose is very frontal. Jesus is blessing with his hand. It's actually forming the letters I-C-X-C. See, it's kind of like this. I'll do it this way. Watch my hand. I, and this finger's bent, C, and these two fingers are crossed, X, C. So it's I, C, X, C. This one's bent here, so it goes this way. I, C, X, C. Jesus Christ. And this is how the priest in the Byzantine church blesses. The Latin rite tends to hold his hand like this. We hold it like this because it's forming those letters I, C, X, C. Those are the same letters you'll see and signified by Jesus' hands in iconography. He has his fingers in that same way. Again, it's the idea that this is the blessing of Jesus Christ, not the priest. The priest is only communicating the blessing of Jesus Christ, and that is symbolized by I-C-X-C. If we go back to our icon of Christ, we see in the halo 3 letters, looks like a W, an O, and an N. These are actually ancient Greek letters which say Hoon, which means I am who am. In other words, this is Jesus Christ, the second person of Trinity, who took on human form. He was God and man, but he was definitely God. In other words, Hoon, I am who am. In other words, Yahweh. So just from a few of these symbols, few of these rules, as it were, we can see in iconography the communication of the faith. And that's why it is such a significant form of art. Now, icons can be painted on wood. They can be painted on the walls of churches as murals. That's my favorite form. In fact, if you go onto the website www.byzantinecatholic.com, that's byzantinecatholic.com, you can see the icon murals that I've painted in my own church, floor to ceiling. So you get an idea of how Eastern churches are designed and decorated using iconography. In other words, the architecture and the art all go together. It's not separated. The art is not sort of just, I call it tattooed on there, or like hanging a picture to make the wall look nice. The wall is not the important thing. It's the character of the architecture together with the icon. One is sort of wedded to the other because they all together, the architecture, the motifs, the shapes, and the paintings, the color and line on the wall, are all communicating that theology and color. They're making visible, invisible realities. Now, if you want to paint an icon, as I mentioned earlier, the first thing you want to do is research it. Look at all the different renditions of that icon that you can. There's something else you must do too. iconography is a prayerful art. In fact, it was developed in monasteries, and many people who consider themselves to be iconographers, bona fide iconographers, are people who live lives that are very much, if not in fact, monastic. Because you see, iconography is considered to be like a vocation, and it's very tied, as I mentioned, to monasticism. So it's serious business. So people who paint icons, I don't mean just as a hobby or dabbling. We're talking about something very serious here. We're talking about the official art of the church, communicating theology. People who do that as a vocation have to pray. They have to live a life of prayer. They have to pray before they paint. They have to pray during their painting. They have to pray after their painting. They have to live a life according to the teachings of the church. They have to live what it is they paint. They have to love God. They have to die to self, to their own artistic ambitions, and defer instead to the art itself, to the art of the icon, the image making visible what is invisible. So that's the attitude. First, you got to start with the right attitude. Again, iconography is serious business. It's not just supposed to be a hobby or a craft or a fun thing to do. It is serious business. Just like translating or writing the scriptures is serious business. You approach it prayerfully, you research it to make sure you're staying within the canons, and at the same time seeing what kind of variations you can have. But at the same time, you want to make sure you're painting this icon correctly. You're capturing the correct theology. Now, the next thing is, it's helpful to have some artistic ability too, because iconography is an art. And let's face it, it's something we're doing for God. So we want to give our best for God. Not just anyone should do icons. You should have at least some degree of artistic ability. Just like music. If we have musicians in the church, their talents are dedicated to offering the most beautiful sound in prayer and chant to God. You just don't have anybody call themselves a church musician. Same thing with art, and same thing with iconography. So it's good to have a certain artistic ability. You don't have to be a Michelangelo, you don't have to be a genius, but you have to combine all of those elements. The prayer, the attitude, the understanding, the theology, the research, the self-discipline, and artistic ability. So let's start to move into actually what it's like to create an icon. As I mentioned, you use a little bit of artistic discipline and artistic talent as well when you do an icon, as well as the theology and the other disciplines. So when you start out painting an icon, what you're going to do is you're going to look at your picture plane here and decide, okay, is it a very frontal pose? So it's a good idea to kind of, I like to almost make a little axis on what it is that I'm going to draw. You start out with a drawing. So I kind of keep it sort of central. And let's say you're going to paint the face of Christ. Let's just look at the face. When you draw, a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll start to draw like the outline. They see images as an outline, start to draw an outline, or start with some kind of detail. You actually want to start with the biggest and work to the smallest. And it's interesting that the process of doing an icon is actually a participation in certain truths of life. For instance, in life, we start out with the big picture, the big understanding. You know, what is life about? What is God about? Then we go all the way down to seeing God and the answers to life in the tiniest little decisions and events of our lives. That's how life is lived. That's how understanding occurs. What we do with iconography is do the same thing. We sort of parallel or participate in the process of life in the way that we do icons. So we start with the biggest thing first. Start with your biggest shapes. I'm going to draw, when we say we want to draw or paint the face of Christ. Okay, what is a face? The face, when you break it down, is kind of there's geometry to it. There's a kind of a circle, and then there's kind of like the chin area. So already you have a characteristic of the face. Very similar when you do a hand. Always keep things geometric. It's like this. A hand, think of it as sets of geometric shapes. Notice how the fingers, they go wide at the middle and then thinner at the end. once again, wider at the middle, then narrowing as they come in towards the hand. You see what's happening here? You see how, in a sense, quote unquote, supposedly simple it is to start to draw something as complex as a hand. Now, you come into the thumb, and a lot of times you can use it as a square, almost like a circle, with one appendage and two appendages like this. Again, geometric shapes, see? Already you're starting to have the feel of a hand. Now what you do, though, is then you begin to go and refine it, see, like this. So it looks a little bit more and more like a real hand. But it's almost like you start out with a skeleton or some little bit of anatomical knowledge. But you interpret it through geometry, through geometric shapes. In other words, the largest shapes working down to the details. In other words, you don't start out drawing a fingernail or something. You start out by indicating through geometric shapes. Well, it's the same thing with a face. Remember, we have our axis. Icons are very frontal. So you want to start out like this, lightly, to keep it symmetrical. You know, you want the chin all crooked and so on. Then what you're going to do is you're going to keep in mind certain proportions. The eyes should be about halfway, about the halfway point. That's where your eye is going to be. You're going to start lining things up. It's like building a house or something. Again, you start with the biggest things, and you got to get the foundation right. Otherwise, the details won't come out right. You go about halfway down. That's about where your eyes are going to be. About halfway after that is about where the nose is going to be. About halfway from there is where the mouth is going to be. You can see how we're starting to line up our figure. Then what I usually do is I usually start to then give the whole geometric pattern here a little more shape. Like, for instance, with the hairline. The hairline is going to come around the forehead, down towards the cheekbones. Just basic indications to keep the thing fluid, keep it geometric. You know that Christ, if you're painting a picture of Christ, you know that the hair is going to come over the skull, so it's going to take on this shape. There's a little part in the middle. You bring it around. Now around about here, you're going to indicate where his ears are going to be. See? Now the head has to be on a neck, so you start to indicate the neck, and about where the shoulders will be. So you see, what you start to do is you start to refine it closer and closer to what it would really look like. Now let's go with indicate some of the face in here. Well, let's put a little more hair in here. His hair kind of goes over his shoulder. In iconography, his hair comes around and falls over the opposite shoulder. Okay. In the center here, we got it lined up. We're going to indicate the nose. Okay. In iconography, the nose is something like this. It comes down. There's kind of a ball here, with where the nostrils are. The eyebrows are going to come up like this. Again, we have our axis for the eyes. Now, about halfway is going to be the lips. So the lips in iconography are going to be kind of a little bit smaller. The idea is that we speak little, especially with the saints, but we hear, so the ear is a little more pronounced. In other words, we hear the Word of God. See, the lips are kind of like this in iconography. And that's going to make room for the mustache of Christ and then his beard and other details. Then you start to just indicate about where the eyelids will be, and then the eyes. Now, in between the two eyes, it's important to remember the spacing. Very important for the spacing. In between the two eyes, from the one corner of the eye to the other corner, should be the length of one eye. That's very important. Otherwise, he'll start to look kind of cross-eyed. And again, that'll be kind of amateurish. So you just sort of indicate it, because you don't want to solidify it yet, because this is just going to be the drawing that you're going to apply then to the board. Now over time, we can develop this even further, but you get basically the idea. And what you do is, once you start getting your foundation in, you start to make the lines a little bit darker, a little more permanent. Then what you're going to do is what I like to do. You can either use a carbon, or what I like to do is I like to take a piece of chalk or something like this. And I put chalk on the back, or carbon paper, And then you take this and you're going to apply it to the board that you're going to paint the icon on. Then you retrace your lines so that what comes out are not any of your foundational lines. I call it your thinking out loud lines. What's going to come out is your final lines. They're going to be your guide for your icon. Now sometimes the old technique they used to use, especially when they did frescoes, was they would actually take the lines, they would make holes like this. They would put holes along the line. Then they would put this, they called it a cartoon, they'd put it up onto the surface of the wall, and they took like a bag of chalk dust, and they would pounce it like this, and the chalk dust would come through those little holes that you poked, and then the image would come out onto the fresco, onto the plaster. So what do you do now once we get our drawing together? Just indicate it. Again, you don't finalize anything too much because it's still always in process. Remember, art is always in flux to the very last stroke. I often laugh when people say to me, I'll start out with a painting and it'll be not even a quarter of the way done. They say, well, gee, is that how it's going to look? No. Come back when I put on the very last stroke. I'll call you then. That's when you'll decide how to look. So we take our cartoon, our drawing, and we have to have an appropriate board. Here's a board that's used in iconography. You notice it's a piece of wood. I usually use birch so it doesn't warp. It's a very nice surface. And what we do is we cover that surface with a canvas. Well, first of all, we hollow it out. See how there's like a little ledge in there? It's like the recess here. The picture plane is actually recessed, and there's sort of a natural frame that happens then. We hollow that out. We put the canvas over this. It gets glued down. Then there's layers of this white substance called gesso, which is then put on there, layer after layer. When that dries, it's sanded so that you actually have a very smooth surface with this very nice frame and this kind of recessed area. Then you take your drawing, as we did, the drawing we made, and you would put it against this, pounce it, or go over the lines. The lines, as you can see here, will be transferred, just the lines that you want, will be transferred to your board, which has been prepared. Then you begin to lay in your most basic colors. If you notice, this is the process of iconography. You start from your deepest, darkest colors, and you're going to work all the way to your lightest colors. Because the process is a process of prayer. It's like the process of salvation. Light coming out of darkness. Jesus Christ, the incarnation, the invisible God made visible, light, life. He comes into the world and brings light to it. So iconography follows the same process. You notice the second thing up here, this little area here, that's gold. That gold will actually be used throughout the entire background. One of the reasons gold is used is because it gives a sense of dimensionlessness, because iconography, as I said, a window into eternity. It's trying to depict the dimensionless region of the next life, of heaven. We're painting the person as though they're coming from heaven. So they make backgrounds that give it almost like no dimension, also make it very beautiful and regal and so on, very heavenly. And they use gold leaf. It's like this. Here, the gold leaf comes in little packets with little leaves like this. I use what's called patent gold leaf. It's 23 carats, it's real gold. And what happens is we put a sizing, it's called a sizing, a gold sizing on here, on the part that we want gold. And when that dries and gets tacky, then we take the gold leaf, and I'm going to use an older one, because this stuff's pretty expensive. I'll take one that's already partly used. Now remember, this is metal, but watch this. How about that? That's metal floating around there. That's how thinly pounded this stuff is. We take it, and say this area has a sizing on it. We take it, and we put this against there, and then we do what's called lightly burnishing it. I usually use a brush like this. Then it will stick like it did up there. Then when you're done, you take another piece. I usually take wax paper, and I go back over it, and as you lay one piece of gold leaf next to the other, and then you burnish it, it becomes almost like one plane, one piece of metal. It looks like one dimensionless piece of beautiful gold. It's very tedious work, but it's really worth it at the end. Gold is used a lot in iconography. So we've got our board prepared. We're starting to lay in our basic colors. Again, the big areas down to the small. Now this icon, as you can see, is already in process, so I already started to lay in a little bit of detail, mostly for demonstration purposes. But if you notice what I'm doing here, process of we're laying in the basic colors, especially, for instance, look at the flesh tone. This is where I get the question people ask when they see it in process. You mean he's going to have a green face? Like this, see the green hand? No, it's not green. It's an earthy color. It's an earthy green. It starts out. That's how you lay in your base color. And you're going to move from this more and more gradually to light until you finally have the face. But it's important to work in these layers. It's sort of like almost like semi-transparent layers. And again, it's the process of light coming out of darkness. But you have to start out with these base colors first. So it's the lines, the base colors, and eventually you work more and more towards the light. It's called opening it up. And in fact, in the process, you can see that it's sort of like as if it opens up the whole icon and starts to come alive. You notice here also, there's an indication of what will be eventually a halo that I'm going to paint in red using a compass. And I'll get a perfect little round red halo, which will break the plane of the picture and go into the frame area, again, giving it purposely that sort of dimensionlessness. This is just sort of the beginnings, some of the basics of this art that we call iconography. And next time, we're going to develop this icon and bring it more and more into its fullness so that it will hopefully, worthily, reveal the invisible and make the invisible visible. Glory.